This presentation is your introduction to the second part of our course, the arts in historical context. There are a couple things I want to just tell you about for this new section. First of all, the reading assignments will be longer in parts 2 and 3. So make sure that when you look at the assignment list for each unit, you copy down the page numbers and read all of what is assigned. Of course, what you read will be covered in quizzes and exams. At the very beginning of each chapter, there's a list of key terms. I would give you the advice to make sure that you know those terms as well. It will help you to understand the chapter and to guide your reading so you know what's important as you go through the pages. The other course information I wanted to share with you is that as we go through the chronology of the arts, we'll encounter a lot of different artists and styles. And on the exams and quizzes, there will be identification questions. So those would just be questions where maybe I'll put a photograph of an artwork that we've studied. You would need to be able to identify the artist's name, the title of the work, the style of the work, and the era of the work. So as you're reviewing for quizzes and exams, make sure that you're paying attention to those identifying elements of the works that we study. It could also be a scene from a play and asking you to identify what play it's from, or a little clip of music and wanting you to know what piece you're hearing an excerpt from. More importantly, I want to share with you a few of the themes that I will use to connect the different periods of art that we look at in this second part of the course. The most important theme is that of continuity and transformation. This is the way that we really build literacy and depth to our understanding of the arts. When we look for continuity and transformation, we're acknowledging, first of all, continuity. Continuity refers to the fact that just as you and I exist in a context and we are not immune from the past, we have a relationship with our past and our family's past. The same is true of art. Art and artists are not immune from the past or from other cultures, actually. And continuity is how we can see that relationship from one era to another. Transformation refers to the fact that even though there is a relationship and sometimes some shared concept or image from one age to another, the art doesn't stay exactly the same. It adapts. And transformation is the word that we'll use to describe the changes that we look for from one era to another. Transformation is interesting because it can be a number of different, it can be done in a number of different ways. It can be very gradual, almost seamless from one era to another. But sometimes there's a more distinct or intentional break in tradition in the art world. I'm thinking of the example of Gothic architecture. That's one of the styles that developed very consciously. People argued about whether it was a good idea to pursue this sky-reaching, really glorious style of architecture with light streaming through stained glass windows and a really ambitious and beautiful approach to architecture. But this was argued about. Some people felt that it would be distracting from the religious purpose of the building. And so that's a transformation where we can see a distinct moment, an abrupt and intentional change. Other times we'll find that the artwork changes much more gradually. These next slides are intended to give you an example of what I'm talking about with continuity and transformation. In this example, it's is very visual. You can easily see the continuity and the transformation. So if you look at the figures on this vase, this is a Greek vase from 510 BC, and it's a scene from a symposium. Nowadays, a symposium generally just means a meeting or an extended meeting. Back in the time of classical Greece, it meant more than that. It was a place for educated people to get together and discuss philosophy, the search for truth, goodness, and beauty. But it also was a sensual experience, and the women who are painted on this vase were a special class of women. You might call them a courtesan, but it definitely was not as simple as being a prostitute. These women were hetairai, and they were educated, very intelligent people. They were the only women who participated in the symposia of ancient Greece. So there's a certain sensuality to the depiction on this vase, and you can see the reclining pose, and they're drinking wine. There would have been a lot of free-flowing wine at this symposium. So that's the image we're going to start with. Now, if we go not quite 100 years into the future, this is a figure of Dionysus from the Parthenon. And as many of you may realize, Dionysus is the god of wine, and sort of is often even described as being mad with passion. He's just a very earthy god, if there can be such a thing. It is Dionysus who was the inspiration for the theater festivals that really spurred Greek theater to become such a huge part of their culture. And here you get that same sense of sensuality, the reclining nude figure. Now, sometimes Dionysus is described as almost womanly, and so there's an interesting connection there that this visual reference to the previous pose is being used here at the Parthenon. Now we're going to go forward a few centuries, several centuries, to the Roman sculptural style. And this photograph happens to be a photograph of a 16th century copy of a Roman piece. But in this Roman style, now this is not Dionysus anymore, this is Tiberius, the Roman river god. And the river god is generally seen as a symbol of fertility and plenty. And so here we have, again, the same pose, propped up on the left elbow, the right arm reaching forward, and this is a clear progression from the previous images. So now we go to a work that is actually from the 16th century. It's an engraving that was made after a drawing by Raphael. So Raphael is one of the great Renaissance artists, and he made this drawing in the 15th century, actually. But here we have Raimondi's engraving after that drawing. And if you look closely, you can see the same pose repeated in the figure in the lower right corner. Again, a river god, again in the same pose. This is part of how you can think of reading paintings, because if you are familiar now visually with this image, you recognize this is probably a river god in this context. You've become more literate in art. What I want you to do is look at the three figures, not just the very furthest to the right, but the three figures in the bottom right corner. And keep those poses in mind when we skip forward about 3 centuries to 1863. And here we have Manet's Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe. This was exhibited at the Salon des Refusés, so that means the Salon of the Rejected. During this era in France, there was a national gallery to which and artwork would have to be accepted. But it was a time of great change in the art world. And so many people were rejected from the National Gallery that they actually made a salon of the rejected. And this painting by Monet was one of the most talked about paintings in that exhibit. And you can see why, because he has taken something that was somehow legitimized by the fact that it was portraying gods and goddesses, nymphs who just were otherworldly. And it's taking this idea of nudity and sensuality and making it very much of this world. So these are not gods and goddesses. These are not nymphs who live in the wood and don't need clothing. In fact, we can see the discarded clothing of the female figure in the front left. And not only that, the sensuality of the image is made greater by the fruits and the wine and the bread that are in the picnic basket with them. There are so many parallels and so many differences between this and the preceding images that it makes a great example of continuity and transformation. If you see this canvas without having seen the previous images, it doesn't mean the same thing. But now you can see the great irony and the statement that Monet is trying to make by taking the same visual approach but changing the context entirely. And it's interesting actually to think that in a way it's closing the circle a little bit, because the intermediate images, so the Raimondi that you're seeing now and the Roman river god and Dionysus, they legitimize this sensual reclining pose by depicting gods. But actually, if we go back to the very first example that we saw, this is of the Greeks, and they were very much interested in this world, and these women are not in any way goddesses. So it's interesting to look at these and to see, in fact, continuity and at the same time transformation. The second theme that we'll look at repeatedly is the idea of stability and instability. Many times the general situation of a culture is reflected in its artistic output. Instability can really produce, I'm thinking of the artwork during World War II and World War I, extreme reaction in the work of artists. But other times, it's actually stability or wealth that influence the arts. So this slide is an example of something called intarsia, and it's something that was popular in the Renaissance, where an artist would take small pieces of wood and do such intricate inlay that he creates the illusion of depth. So the picture in this slide is actually a flat surface, and it's wood inlay that gives this optical illusion of depth. And it's just an example of how stability, how wealth can influence the arts. During the Renaissance, there were many wealthy noblemen and merchants who had beautiful villas and wanted a way to exhibit their wealth, and they were very interested in visual art, and so this intarsia was a popular way to decorate some of those rooms. The third theme we'll look at many times is the idea of spirituality versus humanism. For many, many centuries, actually, if we take Western Europe as an example, the church was the main patron of the art. And so theater, music, dance, visual art, it all centered around a purpose, that purpose being to tell the stories of Christianity, to glorify God, to entice people to join the church or to stay in the church. Well, that's very different from other times when the art world has been striving to establish a humanistic viewpoint, something where the artists are trying to address this world, the realities of this life, how to live well and happily during the time that we are on this planet. And the fourth theme that we'll look at is the role of the artist. This has changed so greatly over the centuries. If we think about, for example, the Gothic architecture that I was talking about, Chartres Cathedral is a wonderfully beautiful example of Gothic architecture, but really we know very few, if any, names of the artisans who worked on that church. We think about today, and when there's a famous artist or musician or actor, there's almost a cult of personality where not only do we want to know that person's name, we want to know all about them, and we're interested in their own individual feelings and their own individual biography. That's a huge change, and it certainly didn't happen overnight. And one of the interesting things we will look at as we go through the ages are how that changed and different examples of the role of the artist through the ages.